But it's nice to be with you all this morning or this afternoon. I don't know, it's noon, whichever. Take your pick, morning or afternoon. And we'd like to thank, before we get started, the Jewish Book Council for making today possible. And also thank you to Bonnie and Tamara for co-chairing the Women of WHC Hebrew Literary Club book programs. So this morning we are excited to have Felice Cohen, who will speak about her book, Half In, a coming of age memoir of forbidden love. And I'll put the link to the book in the chat in a bit. But if you have not read the book already, we encourage you to purchase it either from a local bookstore, or you can purchase it through our WHC Mitzvah Mall, which supports WHC's important social justice efforts. So again, I'll put that link in the chat in just a moment. But before I do, as the program goes on today, if you have any questions that you would like me to pose to Felice after she speaks to us, please send them to me directly or privately in the chat so that we don't distract her as she is speaking, and also so I can keep track of all questions that we'll be asking. And so with no further ado, known nationally and internationally as the woman who lived in one of the world's smallest apartments, Felice Cohen is the award-winning author of the bestseller Half In, a coming-of-age memoir of forbidden love. Also, she has written 90 lessons for living large in 90 square feet or more, and What Papa Told Me, a memoir about her grandfather's life before, during, and after the Holocaust. What Papa Told Me was endorsed by Elie Wiesel, and it's taught in schools across the country and has sold around the world as well. And Felice has been featured on Good Morning America, NBC, CBS, NPR, Time, Globe and Mail, New York Daily News, the Daily Mail, and more. So what enabled Felice to live large in that tiny studio is that she has been a professional organizer for over 25 years, and she splits her time between New York City and Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So we turn to New York City and to Felice, and I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Cantor Susan, and a thank you to Rabbi Susan, who was the first one to email me, and any other Susans, and everyone else. You know, it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you choosing me and my book Half In for your book club and through the Jewish Book Council. They're great. This is my third book to go through with the Jewish Book Council, and it's been a great experience every year that I've done it. Getting to meet new people, flying to different places, or doing it on Zoom. It's all great. You know, and in the last dozen years, I have spoken around the country with my first book, What Papa Told Me, which is about my grandfather's life before, during, and after the Holocaust. And though I've spoken at schools and conferences and book clubs and synagogues and tiny house festivals, you know, my favorite groups to speak to are Jewish women. You know, I love the Jewish men too, but, you know, whether to sisterhoods or hadassahs or fundraising galas, it's great to speak with women with similar identities. You know, we might have grown up in different locations and gone to different schools, or be older or younger, but we get each other and there's comfort there. You know, that's important when you are speaking to a large group, especially about a topic that's extremely personal. You know, my memoir, Half In, is at its core an age gap love story. You know, it might be a non-traditional type of love. It might be even a taboo type of love, but it was love, you know. And however, Half In is also about a secret, and one that I kept for 3 decades. You know, after a while, the secret itself, this affair, was no longer what was hurting me. It was really the act of keeping the secret. The shame I felt for loving someone older, and the fear of people finding out, and the bottling up of these emotions. And that was what was hurting me a lot more than this actual secret itself. But once the book came out, all of that shame and fear just kind of washed away. But I'm jumping ahead. I first learned the power of telling your truth from my maternal grandfather, Papa. It was the book I wrote about him. And, you know, I was his first grandchild, and really a testament to his survival. and we were very, very close. And starting at age 8, I begged to work in his Brooklyn grocery store when we visited from Cape Cod for the holidays. And I loved putting on that dirty apron and ringing up customers and counting out change, as I'd been told. And my grandfather, he would beam from behind the deli counter, smiling with his sad eyes and telling everyone in his heavy European accent, that's my granddaughter. And it really wasn't until years later that I understood where that sadness came from. In college, I accidentally found out that my maternal grandmother, Fela, the woman I am named after, didn't die of cancer as I'd been told my whole life, but she committed suicide. And I wanted to know why she did it, but I also wanted to know, why my papa and my mom and my 2 uncles had been keeping it a secret for years. So I asked my grandfather, and at first he was silent, never having spoken to anyone about her suicide, but he soon began to speak. And I don't know if it was because enough time had passed or because we were so close or perhaps because, he was finally ready to be free of that secret. But in order to tell me why she committed suicide, he first had to talk about another subject he never spoke about, and that was the Holocaust. Now, at the time, I was an op-ed columnist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I know, shocker, right? A Jewish woman with an opinion. But I wrote about my grandmother's life in the Lodz ghetto and in Auschwitz and coming to New York and her PTSD and even being put in a mental hospital and her eventual suicide. And of all the feedback I got, the most significant was from my grandfather, who finally felt relief having unburdened himself from her secret. And that's when he asked me to tell his story. He wanted his children and his grandchildren and great grandchildren to know how he survived, by working hard and being lucky, but also why he survived. And that's because every day for 5 years in 8 different camps, he believed one day he would have a wife and children to replace all of those who were murdered. So it began our journey of talking about pain and starvation and death and secrets and hope. And it was never meant to be a book. It was just something to hand out to the family. But over the years, my grandfather started to call it a book. And he began to tell everyone that his granddaughter was writing a book about his life. So the pressure, was on. And I had never written a book. I had no idea. And I would work on it, but then my life got in the way and I moved to New York and I had other jobs. And every once in a while, I put the book away, and every once in a while my grandfather would call and he'd say, "So how's the book? I'm not getting any younger. I want to be here. I should read it." I don't think I need to explain to you what Jewish guilt sounds like, but I didn't take it as guilt, right? I took it as motivation because this was the only thing my grandfather had ever asked me to do besides eat. That's what the grandparents do. But when his book came out and it started selling around the world, thanks to a YouTube video of me living in a 90 square foot tiny apartment, people wrote to me saying they bought my book, that they thought my grandfather was a hero, and they thanked him for telling his story. Now, my grandfather was almost 90 at this part, and when the book came out, we spoke together at a number of schools and colleges, and the reactions from people, young and old, were incredible. They wanted to get their photo taken with him, they wanted to hug him, they wanted to fist bump him, and it validated for him that he survived for a reason, but that he also went through that struggle of telling me all of what he went through. Even when he started to cry, it gave his life meaning. And it helped him to move on from that, even though it was 70 years later. And wherever he went, he would ask people, "Do you have internet?" And then he would tell them to buy and read his book. And, it was, I thought, the best gift I had ever given in my life because I wrote that book only as a gift for him, never planning on selling it. But it turns out that it was really a gift from my grandfather to me, not only in terms of making me an author and giving me a career as a Holocaust educator, but it showed me the power of revealing my own truth, which brings me back to Half In. I know that was a long intro, but I wanted you to understand how it all kind of comes together. And, while this memoir, Half In, is at its core a love story, it's also about a secret love affair I had at age 23 with my boss, Sarah, a woman who was 34 years older and had a long-term partner. Now, before I get into the details, I always start my book talks with a question, a way to engage and understand my audience. And With my grandfather's book, I always ask, how many of you are or were close with your grandparents? And most hands usually go up. And with my book on organizing, I ask, how many of you could live in 90 square feet? And usually no hands go up, understandably. But with half in, I want to ask, and you don't have to raise your hands, just think about it. This might be true for you or might not, but how many of you have ever had a secret, whether related to love or not? And did keeping that secret affect you? Or did you feel the need to share it? Did you try to share it? Did you feel better after sharing it? Or have you not been able to share it, and is it still burdening you? You know, that's been one of the takeaways of this book of Half In for me, how much better my life has become since telling my secret. But it wasn't easy. I worked on this book for over 15 years. Writing is very solitary. There were many instances in working on the book that I would think, does this suck? Is anyone going to read it, besides maybe my mom? And the dozens of rejection letters from publishers didn't help. I know this is not an original story. A lot of authors can talk about this. And it's hard to kind of think, does this, what I'm writing, have value, especially a memoir where it's so personal. But the one reason I never gave up was because I wasn't writing the story for the masses or to make money or to be a New York Times bestseller. I was writing it for me. I began writing it as therapy to get over the loss when Sarah died. 10 years after our affair began, she died. And during the years of working on it, I would stick it in the proverbial drawer because it was too painful to remember. And it was too daunting a goal. I really didn't know where to begin, what to do, but I always came back to it because something in my life was unfinished, and I believe the answer was in the completion of this book. I mean, that was kind of what was keeping me going. And so I started writing it in 2003, shortly after Sarah died, when I was forced to mourn her as I had loved her in secret. It began one night when I had a dream in which Sarah had come to me, and I had said to her, what are you doing here? We told everyone you died. Before she could respond, I woke up and grabbed my journal and I just wrote about the dream. And I just started writing all these thoughts and feelings that had come up. And, I worked on that piece and I ended up entering it into a first chapter writing contest just on a whim. And I won. And that was surprising to me. I won $1,000 and I got to give a reading at a New York City public library. And it was at that reading where an agent came up to me and he asked, how much of the book do you have completed? And I thought, what book? But that was the moment that the seed to write this book was planted. Now, this was before my other books had come out, and I never thought of writing a book. I loved writing. I loved writing columns, but a whole book, and now here I wondered, how do I start? Where do I begin? I mean, I was clueless. Now, in this case with Half In, I started by typing up my journals from those years and all the letters we wrote back and forth. Just as a reminder, this was 1993. There was no email. Um, I was a college grad. Well, there was a little email, but I was a college graduate and I had moved back home and I was really unsure of what I was supposed to do in the real world. And I felt lost. The one comfort I had was writing in my journal, something I had been doing since middle school, when my English teacher encouraged me to write down my feelings since it was hard for me to express them. So here I was, I took all my journal entries and I took all our letters and I typed them all up and I put them into chronological order. And I thought, hey, this is a book. It wasn't a book. It wasn't even close to being a book, but it was a start. And, for many of us, whatever goal we're striving for, the hardest part is that first step. So one of my early editors was Leslie Ann Newman. She's the author of almost 50 books, including Heather Has Two Mommies. We had become friends when I lived in Amherst, and she helped me to create a focus for the book. Kind of the book was just a lot, and she helped me really kind of narrow down the story I wanted to tell. And I had around 160,000 words. And one of the first things she said I had to do was cut half of them. I pretty much panicked at first because I thought, how do you do that? You might have heard the expression killing your darlings. Well, this was more than darling. This was like half of my book. And then, as a professional organizer, I decided to look at it as though it were a closet that I had to unclutter. I had to organize it. And as soon as I switched that kind of thought of how I looked at it, it became just like another organizing job, something else I had to declutter. This time it wasn't shoes or bags, it was words. And, then it became a challenge. And there was one I was really excited about. And also having that kind of focus, I would remind myself what that focus was. And if it didn't connect, I would get rid of it. And every few years after working on Half In and sticking it in the drawer, I have a big drawer apparently, taking it back out again, I would hire a new editor to read an updated draft. Now, each editor brought her own unique critique in shaping the story, what I needed, what I didn't need, what would be helpful, what was still missing. And what all the editors had in common was their push to get me to reveal more feelings. Again, I was still holding back. And again, expressing my feelings wasn't easy. So this was really no surprise, but it was almost like pulling teeth. I really had to ask, well, can you give me an example of how do I express a feeling? And I mean, and it took a lot. It took a lot of practice. And and I think another part of it was that I was still protecting our secret. When you live with a secret, you're always watching your words. What can come out, what can't come out, and I was still fearful of what people would think. When I talk today, people are really stunned about this because it's so different today than it was back in the early 90s. But however, with every edit, and there were hundreds of edits, I would reveal a little more and a little more. But the reason I think it took so many years to write this book was never about the writing process, but instead the healing one. I initially started writing to get over the loss of Sarah, but there was a second reason. And there was a reason I really wasn't aware of at first, and not even until maybe kind of towards the end of writing the book. And it turns out that because of that affair, you know, I was 23 and it was still a young, impressionable age that I developed a pattern, kind of a learned behavior with relationships. And it became one that I was repeating in every subsequent relationship after Sarah, both with women and with men. I was only ever half in these relationships. I was keeping one foot out the door, still protecting my heart and never allowing myself to fall in love again after that. I had been hurt so badly. And anyway, so the writing allowed me to express my sadness and grief. So that was very helpful. But the secret was still a secret because this was between me and my laptop. So I was still hiding my past. And, I thought about this and in therapy, and you talk about it. And I realized the only way to break this pattern was to put my story out there and reveal my secret. Was I scared? Yes, very scared. This was the scariest thing I had ever done. And everybody said, so what was the final push to get you to finally publish it? And the answer was the pandemic. You know, we were talking about this when we first came on, but 2 months into COVID, I moved home to Cape Cod from New York City to help my parents and to get out of the city because it was kind of scary here in New York. And as I'm sure as you remember, it was a really uncertain time. And Thomas Wolfe says you can never go home again, right? But I think he was wrong. You can go home again. And granted, it helps you if you have a big house with lots of rooms and everyone has their own space. I know the cantor knows what this is like now that she's just built an addition on her house. But, seriously, um, during the pandemic in our little 3-person pod with myself and my parents, with all the scariness going on in the world and really feeling vulnerable, I quickly realized how short life was. We have instances in our lives where we're reminded of this, and this felt like I was on a roller coaster and people were just falling off left and right. And I thought of all the things I wanted to tell my parents about my life that, we're very close. I've always shared everything with them, but really the most important thing was how I had once been in love. And they never knew that, all the other relationships I'd been in, they knew I had never quite been in love. And there had been a number of relationships, but, they were concerned, they wanted me to be happy. My name means happy, and they just wanted that for me. And that's all they ever wanted. And, so I finally thought to myself, what am I waiting for? Right? What, what am I waiting for, especially now at the scary time? So, part of why I kept that relationship a secret all those years was because I had been afraid of disappointing my parents. You're a nice Jewish kid, you want to please your parents, you want to do these things for them. And, that was kind of the role I always played. And now, I was almost 50 and I thought, it's time to tell them everything. And, their reaction was not what I feared. What they both said was they wished I had told them what I was going through back then so that they could have been there to support me. And, that was, even though I started crying at the time, it was my aha moment. Like, okay, my parents support me. They still love me. They don't care. And I thought, why should I care what anybody else thinks? The only opinion I really care about were theirs. And that was the moment I felt finally ready to let the book out into the world. So, one of my other jobs is giving motivational talks. And during the pandemic, I continued to give these, but now on Zoom. And the one thing I said to encourage people to reach their goals was, if I told you the pandemic would be over in 3 months, okay, what would you like to have accomplished by then? And this new perspective turned the quarantine into an opportunity. Suddenly, we all had more time, right? We weren't traveling, we weren't attending events, we weren't showering, at least for me. But after one of these motivational talks, I turned that question on to myself and I asked myself, if I had 3 months to kind of what was to get something done, what would I want to be done? Without thinking, it was, I want this book to be published. I'd been working on it all these years. So I gave myself a deadline, which is very important when you want to have a goal. It's very important to give you kind of, something to aim for. And I didn't look back, you know. And in fact, during that time, my dad was one of my editors. And let me just say, if you've never had your father edit your personal sex scenes, I highly recommend it. I don't know if he feels the same, but it was truly a bonding experience. And I remember when the book launched and I did it in my hometown on the Cape, and we had, about 65 people, and my parents were there, and my dad stood up when I mentioned this, and he said, yes, it was a bonding experience. And it's probably also why I added a little humor into those sex scenes, just because, I knew he was reading it. But um, I think, I love what Dr. Ruth says, and I especially do this when I talk about the Holocaust, how, a lesson taught with humor is a lesson remembered. And I always remember that. And I think it's important to always have humor. And as Jews, I think we are well aware of that. But, it's interesting. This book could not have come out 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Not only was I not ready, but neither was society. It feels like society and I have reached this moment together at the same time. And you might remember in the early 90s, uh, when our affair began, the motto was don't ask, don't tell. Right. And what is it today? Love is love. So, what's even remarkable is that a few months before my book came out in September 2002, the New York Times published an article saying that LGBTQ romance books were one of the biggest sellers. And I thought, who knew? I didn't plan for that. It just was this kind of another Bashert moment that it was, kind of all kind of coming together for me. And while yes, the book is about this 23-year-old woman who falls in love with someone, much older and is forced to keep it a secret, there are a few other themes. One is, figuring out who you are and where you fit in as an adult in the real world. It's also about figuring out your sexuality. Now, in the early 90s, there were pretty much two choices, right? Straight or gay. Today, there are, a lot many more choices. And for some, it still might not be easy. It still can be difficult, but with more than 36 different sexualities, it's no longer one size fits all. We see this with our kids, our nieces, our nephews, our grandchildren. Everybody is something else. We've got pronouns, we've got this and that, and I can't even keep track. But one of the things I find amazing and is ever since my book has come out, people are confiding in me their most personal secrets. Like I'm talking affairs that they've had. Everybody just thinks I'm like I'm a safe person to tell, and I am. And I love when people feel open enough to tell me. But it's just amazing how this book has kind of, opened the floodgates for my truth, absolutely, but others as well. It's been 31 years since my affair with Sarah began, and even talking about it is still new. It's still somewhat new, and there have been talks where I get choked up or whatever, but, imagine keeping a secret for decades. And then suddenly, not only does everybody know, but they're asking you deep personal questions about it. I'm not complaining at all. I love it. In fact, every time I talk about it, I feel more empowered. And it's been this amazing experience putting a book into the world. I had this experience with my grandfather, and that was incredible. And that was his story. Writing about living in a tiny apartment and how I wound up in a shoebox and lessons for living, in any size space to declutter. But this book is like taking your heart out and sticking it, on the internet. And it's been incredible. And, the reviews have been amazing, and I've won awards, and the book reached #1 in 7 different Amazon categories. Um, it was even endorsed by Rita Mae Brown, the iconic author who wrote Ruby Fruit Jungle, and we did a talk together last year. I mean, when you work on something and you're not sure what the reaction's going to be, and then someone who you admire, who's in your, who, does what you do, reaches out and pats you on the back, it's just so rewarding. And it's really just getting this book has allowed me to heal and move on and really just let go of that burden I was carrying. But I have to say the icing on the cake has been falling in love again. Um, and I actually, I've met somebody new, and it's been almost a year, and I actually met the person through Rita Mae Brown. So, it's an interesting feeling being all in. It's a freeing feeling. It's a wonderful feeling. And I wish it had happened sooner, but everything happens for a reason, and it's all good. I mean, I feel I'm happy about it. It's funny, after Half In came out, a childhood friend who's known me since I was 4 said, you had to tell your grandfather's truth before you could tell your own. And I think she was right. I don't think I would have had the guts or the belief to see what a relief it could be to rid yourself of secrets. It's such a burden. I feel like it can make you sick and cause stress and all of that. And, I hope that if any of you are holding on to a secret, or even just something you want to get off your chest, that you can find a way to do it. Maybe go to therapy or tell a friend, or write it down. And I remember this one time I teach a memoir workshop, and it's called From Pain to Prose. And once she really wanted to reveal the secret, but she was afraid that someone would read it. So I suggested that she write it down and then, get it off her chest, which is really helpful. There's something when you write that, your heart rate goes down, and you're able to kind of pull the angst out of your head through your hand and write it down. And there's studies on it. It's amazing. It helps. And I said, after you write it down, burn it. Set it on fire, put it in a fire pit, let it go. And she was skeptical, and I had just kind of pulled this out of my back pocket, but she was willing to try it. And she now does this as a weekly routine. It's part of this healing regimen for her. And she said, it's been the most freeing thing she's ever done. And I get it, you know. There were times I thought of burning my manuscript a few times, but it took so much out of me to write this book. It took energy and emotion and time and money, uh, and time I wasn't working, I was writing, but it was worth it. It's been an amazing journey. And when I was 23, I was so focused, as most young early 20s are, on trying to figure out my purpose, right? And I thought it was something you became, like a writer or a doctor, but I soon realized that our purpose, at least for me, is more about the journey than what we become. You know, there wasn't Google back then, but I recently Googled, why is finding your purpose important? And I was really, I loved what it said. It said, people who know their purpose know who they are. They know what they are, and why they are, and when you know yourself, it becomes easier to live a life that's true to your core values. When you're not covering your tracks or thinking about what you have to say or be afraid to express yourself. And again, it's not easy to figure out. When we're younger, we're so focused on getting somewhere. And then when we get older, we realize, it's just a journey and we're all unique. We're all complicated people. But I think what I was really struck by what it said was, you know, about living a life that's true to your core values. And it wasn't until I freed myself of my secret did I understand that I wasn't just lying to everybody else, I was lying to myself. You know, I had, I had not only now been relieved of this huge secret, but it enabled me to also break that pattern and future patterns of being in relationships where I was lying, where I wasn't really happy, where I was just kind of in it. And I just thought, never again am I going to do that. I don't want to. And writing this book was part of figuring out who I was and who I am. And it was so freeing. I worked on the book and edited. And then, once the book comes out, it's like, I can't read it anymore. I heard an author speak the other day and said, once your story is out there, it's no longer your story, right? It's the world's story. It's everybody else's story. And, you know, it's been, it was a struggle until you get there. And I hope if any of you are struggling that you can find a way to let go of that, to share what's bothering you. You can always email me or send me a text, but I really think it's important to not hold those secrets in, because they hurt. So, I love to be able to talk about this, and I appreciate you all for listening. And I would love to hear from you, your thoughts or feelings, your personal secrets, whatever you want to share. And again, thank you for having me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Felice. Um, and we have a few questions for you, but before I do, I just want to share again the link to the book. If any, I just threw it in the chat again. So if you haven't had the opportunity to read the book, I highly encourage you to do so. And there, you're holding yours. I've got mine right here as well.
Thanks.
Um, and if you do have questions, just a reminder, put them privately to me in the chat and we'll see what we can do about getting them all in. And before we go to questions, I just wanted to comment on your, what you ended up pulling out of your back pocket, the suggestion of writing down the secret and then burning it. It reminded me of two very Jewish rituals that we have, right? In preparation for Yom Kippur, of course, we have the ceremony of tashlich, where we put our sins onto a piece of bread and then throw it into the river, even though we now know that that's not so great for ducks, but that's okay. But the idea of putting, releasing something from that we're holding in and then throwing it away. It's something that we do every year in preparation for Yom Kippur, and then also in the preparation for Passover. Traditionally, as one would clean the house, they leave a little bit of chametz, on the counter in a safe place that they collect, which they then burn, right? The idea that you burn those last pieces to make sure that it's all gone. So I just wanted to throw that in there, and not really to raise a question about it, but just say that it's a very Jewish thing that you recommended, which I think, as certainly in half in, and I'm sure even in your, I have not read your grandfather's book, though it sounds fascinating, and I would like to. It's you don't shy away from being a Jewish person, right? In your writing, it's very much who you are, and you even talk about introducing Sarah to different Jewish things and services and what have you. And so, I appreciated that, it's a memoir and that you're being fully open with who you are, and that includes being a Jewish woman.
Yeah. It's interesting because growing up on Cape Cod, I always felt I was more preppy than Jewish. And we went to a Reformed temple, even though my parents grew up keeping kosher and all of that, living how they grew up. But I was a little apprehensive about people knowing I was Jewish. I mean, I had a bat mitzvah, but I knew the Holocaust, and I was afraid of people being anti-Semitic. And of course, today it's a little different. It's horrible. But um, it wasn't until my grandfather's book came out and I started speaking around the country that here I was talking about something, and I was right out there. And so I felt like I came out first as Jewish before I kind of came out as being queer. And I thought, that was really kind of an interesting journey for
Yeah,
myself, and to be comfortable with that. It helped, by writing my grandfather's story.
absolutely, absolutely. And of course, your name, I mean, there's no way to hide it, right? Cohen. I mean, that's
Tribe has spoken. Yeah.
right. You mentioned at the beginning a bit about, the process of going through and writing your grandfather's story and how that is really what enabled you to write this story. So I wanted to ask you, when it comes to, organizing the book or editing it or purging, what have you, is it easier to do when it's someone else's words and stories or your own? Like, what is the process, and is there a different process perhaps when you're purging someone else's versus purging your own words and stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when it's your own, we have those kill your darlings. You're attached to every word you write as a writer. That's beautiful prose, right? It's not. But it's your own. You also have the story in your mind, especially with memoir, because I see what people look like. I might not describe them really well on the page. And so it helps to have somebody else helping you edit your own stuff as well. So when I'm editing someone else's, I want to make sure that I can see that. So whether I'm telling them to get rid of words that may be extraneous, or what they need to add, it's just like I do when I'm working with someone with their closet. Like I'll take a shirt out and I'll say the '80s called, and they ask for this back. Anything with shoulder pads, bye bye. That's what my sisters do to me. But it just takes some perspective, I think. And it's you don't always know where someone's coming from in their writing.
Mhm.
So you really have to make sure you have that dialogue with someone else. Like what is your goal? But when I teach my workshop, it's more, I really use the organizing to start writing. So the workshop, I'm not really editing anyone's work. I'm helping them create an outline and keeping them and giving them steps to be motivated to keep writing and to get to the finish, because it's not easy.
Mhm.
It takes a long time sometimes, in my case, to write a book, but it is, again, it's the journey of writing the book. It feels great to be able to say, this is my grandfather's book, but to have it. And I remember when the book came out, I got a draft, I got a copy of it, and I'm standing out in the street of Manhattan just crying because I worked on it and I called my grandfather and he's crying. And it was something we had worked on together for so long. And even if you want to just write it to pass it down to your children or for whoever, it's a really good feeling, any accomplishment, to put your words down, because it's not easy. And we like to express ourselves, and it's helpful to show where you've been.
Yeah. So on the expressing, did you find that in this book that the emotions that were triggered in you, um, like did you, is that what made this process so long for you, in that it kept triggering emotions, or did you feel like as you were writing it, it was just a release and you could keep working? Like how did, because I imagine writing this triggered plenty of emotions for you that not only did you not admit to the world, but you may not have admitted to yourself.
Yeah, I would put it away when things got too tough, or I thought, can I do this? Or what am I doing? Or I don't know how to do this. And also when I would get emotional, I went to therapy after Sarah passed because I just didn't know how else to express these feelings. I mean, you go through mourning steps and stages, and I couldn't really go through those stages, not publicly. So that was hard. And the writing, I'd be writing, I could barely see the page. I'd be just, blubbering. And I think part of it was, the sadness of grief, but also feeling like I couldn't tell anybody how I felt. And in the book, where there's a scene with the therapist who said to me, who compared it to, because she knew I was an athlete, that you won a gold medal. What would that feel like, right? Winning a gold medal. But then how would you feel if you couldn't tell anybody you won it? What? That's like when you're falling in love and you can't tell anyone. I finally understood, I was like, why do people need to get married? Like, but I get it. You want to share your love and see that reflected back. And part of it was also because when I would stop, I worked on my grandfather's book, and then I moved I moved into a tiny apartment. I worked as the chief of staff to the president, Hunter College, where I barely had time to sleep. So all these other things were going on in my life, but I always found my way back to this book, and it became a comfort every time I would sit down to edit. I looked at it as though I was visiting Sarah. It was how we met, how we fell in love, and how it ended. But every time I would get out a new red pen and a stack of the manuscript, and I would just dive in. And so part of it was also I didn't want to finish the book because I knew once it was out there, it was not our book again. And when I do readings now, it's funny to go back and I think, oh, all right, I forgot about this scene. I kind of had to let it go.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you find when you do the readings or book talks that you again relive some of the emotions and relive the story, and is that hard, or does that get easier with each book talk?
A few months after the book came out, I recorded the audiobook, and that was some parts were a little bit of a challenge. But doing the readings, I found I'm okay with it. I'm still do a lot of what Papa told me talks, my grandfather's book. I mean, I'm still, especially now, I'm doing these talks, and I had one scheduled. It was 4 days after October 7th, and I had this scheduled for months, and it happened to be on the Cape. My whole family was there. A lot of the community came out because everybody was reeling, Jewish or not. And I opened my mouth and you couldn't even hear me. I just got choked up right off the bat. And we all started to cry. We kind of got it out of our system. And I think sometimes reading from my grandfather's book is still hard, even though it didn't happen to me. It happened 75 years ago. But knowing what my grandfather went through still is horrific. Some of these, it's hard. Even though his book is about hope, right? He survived and he always had that hope. But, I think I can be emotional. And I remember working on the book with my grandfather, I was kind of stoic. And then when I would work on the book, I realized, these aren't facts you read about. And this is my grandfather's history, his personal story. So,
Mm,
emotions are good.
yeah.
Yeah.
Emotions are good, they're healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So who was your many of your family members are mentioned in the book, and you mentioned already that you were living with your parents as you did a good portion of the writing. So who was the first family member to read the book, the manuscript, I should say?
It was my Uncle Mark, who, is big in the book. He's a big character in the book. Um, so 8 years ago, he got cancer and he died 2 weeks after my grandfather died. So it was like a boom, boom. But I remember we were down in Boca with my grandfather. It was years before either were sick. And I gave Mark a draft to read, and he was just sitting by the pool, just laughing at moments and crying. And so I have that memory of him reading it. But he was like my Jiminy Cricket on my shoulder the whole way. He was the one who knew about Sarah from the beginning. He was always like a big brother, so he was the one I confided in.
Yeah.
Mm.
And in that relationship with him, and I'm I'm sorry that he did not live to get to see the success that you're having with the book. Well, and because you're also missing out on the relationship with him, um, but in your relationship with him, did he ever suggest to you that it would be okay to tell your parents about who you were?
Yeah, I mean, one thing was coming out, and I still wasn't sure who I was, and I didn't know that you could be bi. I didn't really understand all that. Again, it was so black and white back then. It felt like, especially when you're going through it, and you didn't have, everybody marching target. It's whatever, everybody, it's out there, right? It wasn't then, and I was nervous, but he always had my back. And one of the biggest decisions before that was deciding not to play sports anymore. I was recruited for two Division One teams, and that I was afraid to tell my parents. I thought that would disappoint them. I mean, it's funny to think about it, but he encouraged me to tell them, and it was fine. And he always encouraged me and he even said being with Sarah wasn't bad. He didn't want me to ever feel bad about it. But you're just scared. When you don't understand. That's why it's so important and so great that today we can talk about things more.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so speaking of Sarah, it was clear in the book that, at many points in your life, as you were trying to determine what path you should take, that she played a role, especially when you were in your 20s and you were young. Um, so how would you say that Sarah impacted the trajectory of your life?
Oh, huge. And not just in terms of relationship. I mean, that was one thing. I went over that, but she was my boss when I worked orientation, and she ran a tight ship, but she was fair, and she just taught me so much about leadership and all the jobs I had after that. She had hired me after I was a counselor to be her assistant director. And then I, just got jobs working at Hunter, and all the other things I've had was, how to speak in public, how to get up in front of, 1,000 people and give a talk, or how to give a tour, or how to run a program, and just learned so much from her, and the confidence to be able to do it. She said, "I know you can do it." So I went and did it, whatever she told me to do. And then I realized, oh, I can do that. And now I've been able to do that, my whole life. So, people have asked me, what do I think she'd think about the book now if she were alive? And she was one of my biggest supporters for writing. And I think she would have, wanted me to do it. And one of her letters, I remember saying, maybe I'll write about this one day. And she said, make sure I'm dead. So I did, but, we joke, but, you know.
I imagine it wasn't easy for her. You've referred back to the, 80s and 90s, being a lesbian woman at that time period. That must have been really challenging in many ways for her.
Yeah, I mean, and even though I was still afraid and I was so much younger, she was really old school in
Mhm.
that. I mean, she lived with someone, they were together for a long time, and then, she cheated on her with me, and that woman's still alive. And I have no contact with her, and I don't know if she's read the book. Probably not. But um, that was one of the struggles for her. Was, she said, "You're so young and you want to be out and everything." And I said, "I don't know. I was scared, but I wanted to be with her, but I also didn't want to ruin their relationship, which was already kind of, I guess, had their holes and spaces and problems, but
Yeah,
it's hard."
yeah, absolutely.
No.
Um, and you referred to, um, well, obviously being an organizer. Um, what was it like living in such a small space in 90 square foot apartment? What's that like? I mean, you see all of us in all of our pictures, and we were all sitting in these nice, lovely rooms, and that overlook nice yards and trees or what have you with our nice big kitchens. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But what was it like? And that's how you grew up as well. So what was it like moving? I imagine even your apartment in Amherst was much bigger than that. What was that like? Because in the book it was clear it was moving to New York was not necessarily the path that you thought was right. I mean, you struggled with where you should go in the book. So in the end, you did go to New York, and then you were stuck in this really small space. So what was that like?
Well, yeah, when I first moved to New York, I lived with my Uncle Mark, in his Bronx apartment, which was big. And, when my grandfather got sick and he said, finish the book already, I was the chief of staff and I worked crazy hours. I had no life. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to give myself 1 year to finish that book. And I want to find a place. I want to try living in Manhattan. I had made good money and I saved and I said, I want to put my money and give myself 1 year to finish the book. And I looked at all these apartments and I looked at places on the Upper East Side because the realtor said your money goes further, but I think she meant faster because the prices were still crazy. And I found through a friend this tiny apartment. And it was a block from Central Park on the Upper West Side where I wanted to live. And it was 90 square feet. And I said, I'm only going to be there 1 year. I said, I can do that for 1 year. It didn't have a kitchen. And it had its own bathroom and had a loft bed. But I said, I can do this for 1 year. And at the end of that year, I put 77 boxes of stuff in a storage. At the end of that year, when the girl I was subletting from said, do you want to stay another year? I didn't even hesitate. I said, yes, because my life had changed. I didn't need space. I had New York City as my backyard and my life was my own. I would wake up and I'd go for a bike ride. I would go to a yoga class. I went to theater. I traveled. I didn't have a lot of overhead, literally and figuratively, if you've seen the video, but it was just life changing. And every year I stayed 5 years. I got rid of more stuff in the storage and I ended up getting rid of all 77 boxes. And the reason I left after 5 years, because the landlord saw me on Good Morning America and he realized that I wasn't the girl on the lease and I was evicted.
Oh
So yeah,
no.
I was, but I had saved for 5 years. I was still working as an organizer and I was still writing and then I ended up saving. And when I remember visiting my grandfather, the book had just gone viral. The video had gone viral. The book was selling everywhere. And I did a lot of talks in Florida. And our first talk together, it was amazing. My grandfather, it was so incredible for him. The kids ran up to him and hugged him. And that night, we're in his apartment in the kitchen. And I told him I was evicted and I had to find another apartment. And he said, I think you should buy a place already. I'm going to give you the down payment. And he said, you lived in a shoebox so you could write about my life. Now I want to help you enjoy yours. And, when I finally stopped crying, I went back to New York and I found this place. And it's 5 times bigger than the tiny apartment. And it's sunny and it has doormen and it's 2 blocks from the tiny apartment. So I love the neighborhood. But living in that tiny place it was freeing, for some reason you just don't have a lot of stuff because think of all the clothes in your closet you didn't wear during the pandemic and probably still don't wear, and all the books on your shelf you haven't read, except for mine, you're going to read. But all these things we have, right? And we don't use them or need them. And we're paying rent or mortgage for stuff we don't need. So I think I always thought I would live in a huge house again, but I don't want to live in a huge house. I would love to buy a little cottage in the country and, if it near a bike path or the water or something. And I don't need a lot of space because we don't take up much space, right? It's all our stuff that does. But it was a good learning. And now I speak around the country talking about that at tiny house festivals and at synagogues and wherever. Um, and I love it. My life, because I lived in that tiny apartment, changed my life, right?
Yeah. There's a really funny comedy sketch by George Carlin, and it's called Stuff, and how he goes on vacation. And then when he gets on vacation, they decide to go to a different island on Hawaii. And so then he has to like pare down his stuff to get into an even smaller bag. And what stuff does he take? And then I think they go again to another. It's hilarious. Anyway,
Yeah. But
So,
it's a good point about when you go on vacation because, right, you can only bring a suitcase, right? I don't know how much Bonnie brought to Antarctica, but I'm sure it wasn't a ton of stuff. But when you're on vacation, it's so easy to get dressed, right? You only have a couple things. So
right.
that's, we don't live like that, but
So now that you're in an apartment that's 5 times larger, do you have stuff?
I have some stuff. I mean, I redid the kitchen, so I have this huge island, and I was interviewed on this South Korean TV station when I first moved in because all the viral, and she said, "Your whole apartment now is a kitchen." And I said, "Well, when I'm cooking, when I have people over, it's a kitchen, but when I'm working, it's just the island, it's my office." But I don't have a lot of stuff, but I'm constantly kind of going through, do I need that? When I come back from the Cape, I always think I haven't missed this. It's a constant, you got to go through every once in a while.
Yeah, you sound like my husband every stage of our renovation, as we were boxing up, as we were unpacking, as we were moving from one floor to the next. He's like, do we need this? We ended up doing lots of purging at
Yeah,
multiple stages. Yeah,
feels good.
it is. It is. Well, thank you so much for today. This has been very enlightening, and again, if you have not read Half-In, I encourage you. It was a very good book, and I would and now I know I personally am planning on going and getting the book about your grandfather because that also sounds really um,
Thank
like
you.
a really heroic journey that he went on, and that you went on together to document that. Perfect, what Papa told me.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
It's been
thank you.